1,000 people came to this desert to build heaven. The true story of Llano del Rio, California, and the two chimneys that are all that's left. Drive east out of Palmdale into the high desert where the Joshua trees take over, and somewhere along Highway 138, you'll pass them. Two tall fieldstone chimneys standing in the sagebrush, with no house attached, a few low broken walls, and further off, a hollow concrete tower rising alone out of the scrub. 100 years ago, this patch of scrubland was going to be a city, planned for 10,000 people, built on one radical idea: that human beings could live together without bosses, without landlords, and without anyone going hungry. They called it Llano del Rio, and for a few short years, it looked like it just might work. Then, it vanished so completely that within a week of the last colonists leaving, most of it had been carried off, board, by their own neighbors. The man behind it was a lawyer named Job Harriman. Born on an Indiana farm in 1861, Harriman trained for the ministry, lost his faith, and found a new one in a book, Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, the utopian bestseller of its day. It made a socialist of him. He was a magnetic speaker who could fill a hall and send the crowd back into the street, fired up. In 1900, he ran for Vice President of the United States alongside the Labor leader Eugene Debs. But his real moment came 11 years later, when he ran for mayor of the City of Angels. He very nearly won. In the primary, he finished first, thousands of votes ahead of the sitting mayor, and went into the December runoff as the favorite. Working people believed he was about to hand them City Hall. And then, 4 days before the vote, everything fell apart. While he campaigned, Harriman was also on a legal team, led by the most celebrated labor lawyer in America, Clarence Darrow, defending two Union men, the brothers John and James McNamara, accused of dynamiting the Times building, home of the city's fiercely anti-union newspaper, in 1910. The bomb was meant to go off at 4 in the morning, by the bomber's own account, when the building should have been empty. It went off instead at 7 minutes past 1, with 115 people inside working the early edition, and the blast and the fire that followed killed 21 of them. Harriman had staked his reputation publicly on the brothers' innocence. He did not know they were guilty. Darrow did, and Darrow arranged a plea to save them from the gallows without telling his own co-counsel. On the 1st of December, James McNamara stood up in open court and admitted he had placed the dynamite. Across the city, thousands of working men wore campaign buttons reading "McNamara's innocent, vote for Harriman." Within hours, they were coming off. 4 days later, Harriman lost. It was the turning point of his life. He came away convinced socialism would never win at the ballot box. So if he could not legislate a better world into being, he would build one far away and let the country watch it succeed. In 1913, backed by wealthy supporters, he took over thousands of acres of dry land in the Antelope Valley, near the headwaters of Big Rock Creek. Ground a temperance colony had already tried to farm and given up on. On the 1st of May, 1914, May Day, the workers' holiday, the Llano del Rio cooperative colony opened. It began with a handful of people, 5 families by one account, 5 colonists by another, 5 pigs, a team of horses, and a cow. Within a year, there were more than 150. At its height, in 1916 and 17, Llano was a working town of 1,000 or more. Orchards pushing back the scrub, a print shop running off the Colony magazine, children in its own classrooms. It isn't hard to see why they came. In an era when a working man might earn $2.50 a day for 10 hours, 6 days a week, Llano advertised $4 a day, a home of your own, schools for your children, and 2 weeks of vacation. But the $4 was never money you could hold. A dollar went to buying off the shares you'd bought to join. The rest went to room, board, and colony expenses. What was left was credited to you on paper, payable only if the colony ever ran a surplus. It never did. Eventually, Llano stopped pretending. You worked, and the colony fed and housed you. And life there was not all labor. Llano had a brass band, 2 orchestras, and dances on Thursday and Saturday nights. It had an assembly hall for debates, a champion baseball team, and a theater troupe called the Live Wires. Its school ran on the Montessori method, one of the first in Southern California, and alongside it, something stranger and better, an industrial school the children called the Kids' Colony, where they raised their own livestock, built their own buildings, and wrote and enforced their own laws. The colony also went through stretches with almost nothing on the table but carrots. They aimed high, too. Colonists built an airplane, one of the first in the Antelope Valley, and on the September morning in 1916, when it was to fly, somebody burned it. No one was ever named. And then there was the city they dreamed of building. Around 1915, Harriman brought in a designer named Constance Austin, self-taught, a feminist, and a socialist, who had spent years on a problem most planners simply ignored: the endless, invisible labor that fell on women. She designed Llano as a great circular city, laid out in rings for 10,000 residents inside a single square mile. And not one of its houses had a kitchen. Instead, meals would be cooked in central kitchens and sent out through underground tunnels, hot food in sealed containers, clean laundry with it, ferried by little electric cars into the basement of every house. The homes had built-in furniture, beds that folded away, warm tile floors. The same tunnels carried the gas, the water, and the wiring, so there was not a single pole anywhere in the city. The point of all of it was to lift cooking, cleaning, and washing, the unpaid work that chained women to the household, off their shoulders. And paper is where it stayed. In May of 1917, Austin stood in front of the colonists with a model of her house. And by then, the colony was already coming apart. Her circular city was never built, not at Llano, not anywhere. The colonists lived in tents and rough adobe while those plans gathered dust. Austin never gave up. 18 years later, at 73, she published the vision in a slim book called The Next Step. The colony had contradictions it never faced. For all its talk of equality, Llano was run from the top down by a board of directors. A colonist named Frank Miller called Harriman the most unscrupulous man he had ever met. The dissenters organized as the Welfare League. Everyone else called them the Brush Gang, because they met in secret and pinned a sprig of sagebrush to their clothes so they would know one another. They wanted every decision put to a vote. Harriman expelled their leaders. And the Utopia had a hard limit written into its own advertising. In April of 1916, the Colony magazine ran a full page announcing that only Caucasians were admitted. Applications from other races had been rejected. And this, the page insisted, was not race prejudice. It was simply that, in its own words, it was not deemed expedient to mix the races in these communities. A community founded on human brotherhood drew a color line through itself and never escaped it. But the thing that truly doomed Llano wasn't its politics. It was water. Big Rock Creek ran seasonally and could not supply the crops 1,000 people needed. In the summer of 1916, the State Commissioner of Corporations refused them permission to build a dam. His reasoning was almost kind. Your people do not seem to have the necessary amount of experience and maybe the sums of money it will involve. Then 20 neighboring ranches sued the colony over the creek, calling the colonists socialistic plunderers who were attempting to cover the face of the earth. Llano lost, and losing the water left the land close to worthless. And the last blow came from inside. One of the colony's own founding investors, a man named Gentry McCorkle, quietly began buying up its shares, trying to take the orchards and the land and run them, in the phrase that has followed him ever since. Without the socialist element, he was stopped. But the fight drained what little was left. Rather than admit defeat, Harriman found 20,000 acres in Louisiana, and in November of 1917, the colony voted to move. Around 200 of the faithful headed east to a worn-out lumber town they renamed New Llano. The California company filed for bankruptcy the following year. That second colony held on another 20 years. But the California Llano, the great circular city in the high desert, was finished. And it did not fade slowly. Aldous Huxley later wrote down what happened. Within 24 hours of the colonists' departure, $500 worth of windows had been smashed. Within a week, a large frame hotel and scores of houses and workshops had been demolished and carried off piecemeal, in his words, by the homesteaders who precariously represented capitalism in the wilderness. Only the silo and the foundations of the cow barn, he wrote, were concrete enough to survive, though the assembly hall's cobblestone footings and its two great fireplaces outlasted him too. That silo had been engineered by a colonist named Bradford Mathewson to hold 300 tons of feed for the colony dairy. And by pure accident, that one unglamorous piece of farm equipment became the only building of the perfect world left standing. As for Harriman, Louisiana never suited him. He came home to California in 1920, worn down and ill, and died 5 years later in Sierra Madre of the tuberculosis he had fought for years. He was 64, his colony and his fortune both gone. And here, the story takes a strange turn. In 1941, an English writer moved into a rough farmhouse on the old colony land. His name was Aldous Huxley, the author of Brave New World. Nearly blind, a pacifist who had left England for California before the war, he fell hard for the Joshua trees and the enormous skies, and became quietly obsessed with the ruins on his doorstep. He sought out the people who had lived there. I have met 3 or 4 ex-colonists, he wrote, older, sadder, possibly wiser, and all of them bore witness to the happiness of those first months. But it was not until 1953, a dozen years after he moved in, that he published what he had made of it. He called the essay Ozymandias, after Shelley's poem about a shattered monument standing alone in the sand, the broken statue of a once mighty king whose empire had vanished without a trace. He was honest about why it failed, and he blamed human nature at least as much as the desert. He told the story of a colonist named Gibbons, who complained endlessly about how things were run and was always too sick to do any work. And for years afterward, at Llano, anyone caught loafing was called a Gibbonite. And yet Huxley came to a generous conclusion. For anyone interested in human beings and their so largely unrealized potentialities, he wrote, even the silliest experiment has value, if only as demonstrating what ought not to be done. For a long time, the ruins were nearly forgotten. Then, on May Day of 1990, the writer Mike Davis walked out among them and opened his book about the city with a line that put Llano back on the map. The best place to view Los Angeles of the next millennium, he wrote, is from the ruins of its alternative future. Today, the ruins stand in the open desert along Highway 138 near the tiny community of Llano, not far from Pear Blossom. The 2 tall fieldstone chimneys are what is left of the hotel and assembly hall, where everybody ate and argued and danced. There is a stretch of open cobble aqueduct running into the brush, and the silo, holed and covered in graffiti. The site is California Historical Landmark, number 933, though the designation doesn't even cover the ruins everybody photographs, and the 150-pound bronze plaque set here in 1982 was stolen within weeks and never replaced. Much of the site is private land posted against trespassing, so see it from the road and let it be. But slow down when you pass. This is one of the boldest experiments in California's history, the place where 1,000 people tried to build heaven on earth in the desert and got close enough to frighten their neighbors. 2 chimneys, some broken walls, and a silo keeping its lonely watch over the valley. Stand there long enough, with the wind coming down off the mountains, and it is almost possible to hear the band playing on a Thursday night, 100 years gone. Many people will never visit Llano del Rio. Many people never knew any of this happened, but now you know. That's the story of Llano del Rio, California, and we're just getting started. If this is your first time here at Lost California, welcome. Every week, we go deep on the towns, the disasters, the scandals, the forgotten stories, and the hidden history that made California what it is today. Subscribe so you don't miss a single episode, and leave a comment below telling us which California city or town you want us to cover next. We'll see you there.